Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the New York Genealogical and Biographical Society's webinar series. My name is Sue Miller, and I am your host for this evening. We'll get started in just a moment or two. We do have people piling in tonight, so we'll give it just a moment here. This broadcast is offered by the NYGNB, and it is live. We do have a question box in the GoToWebinar panel on the right-hand side of your screen, normally on the right-hand side of your screen. So if you have questions during the presentation, you can type them in the box and we'll get to as many of them as possible at the end. We have had some reported issues with sound. If you are not hearing the broadcast, we highly recommend you try another browser first. It seems to be working for most people. This presentation, the copy, the handouts, the contents, the slides, and all the other materials are under copyright and may not be reproduced or shared in any form without prior written permission of the speaker and the NYGNB. And as a reminder, hopefully all of you are already getting the NYGNB e-news. It comes out about twice a month. If you're not receiving it, please do remember to sign up for the e-news. It gives you information about upcoming events, new record sets that are coming online, news, all sorts of other things, good resources you may wish to tackle. You can follow us on Facebook at NY Family History, the same at Twitter and Instagram. And for those of you who are not members, we do have a few free resources on nygbs.org/free-resources. Members have access to much greater resources. So my name is Sue Miller. I'm the Director of Programs and Outreach at the NYGNB. I'm a life member, one of the managing editors of the New York Family History Research Guide and Gazetteer, also known as the Big Book, editor of the New York Researcher, and I've been doing my family history for quite some time. So tonight's topic is accessible and essential records from Kinship. And we're going to talk about Kinship. It's a Kinship Books was founded by Arthur Kelly and his wife, Nancy Kelly. Nancy is also the historian of the town of Rhinebeck. New York has municipal historians, and Nancy is one of those. For many years, they've run a website called kinshipny.com. In late 2014 and honored in 2015, both Arthur and Nancy were made fellows of the New York GNB. That's the designation FGBS, that means Fellow Genealogical and Biographical Society. Fellows are elected for their contributions to the body of work for New York family history and genealogy, and certainly Arthur and Nancy qualify with all they have done over the years. So if you're ambitious, contribute to the body of work of New York genealogy. It's going to be hard to do as much as Arthur and Nancy have done. Arthur's been transcribing records since 1965. He's been indexing as well, published works, early censuses, all sorts of other things. All his publications generally include an index as well as a transcription or abstract. So he has been working on this for an awfully long time, doing all sorts of record types. Those transcriptions and abstracts include things like church records, which are so important in New York, town records, all these things are hugely important in the world of New York genealogy. We'll talk about some of them. Besides those transcriptions and abstracts, there are indexes to published works, including to some periodicals. They have published their own periodicals. There's quarterlies that Kinship published, and they have transcripts and abstracts that were not published in works of their own. Those tended to be smaller groups of record sets, so were done simply in the quarterlies, and we'll go into that. You'll see some examples. They've also published work by other authors and other transcribers. All of that is under the Kinship Books. Their coverage area, clearly New York State is their main place to index and transcribe. There are over 50 counties in New York that have records or indexes, but there are a couple of other states that also have record sets, including Michigan. Where the Kellys live, they've lived in Rhinebeck for quite some time. Clearly, Nancy being the historian of Rhinebeck, the town of Rhinebeck, gives them access to certain records and a network of people. So the concentration of records tends to be in the Hudson, Mohawk, and Schoharie valleys. There is clearly a concentration in Dutchess County. There's a lot of Albany, Columbia, those types of areas. There is also a good body of work for New York City and Long Island. And as you'll probably note, that these are all areas of New York that were settled by Europeans in the earliest times. And as genealogists, it's oftentimes easier to find more recent records. It's those older records that are harder to come by, less accessible, and found usually in only one site in a local area. So we are grateful that the Kellys have added to the body of work in these areas. So the big news that we announced on Facebook Live today was the donation of the Kinship book assets to the NYG&B. So that includes all the published works by Arthur as a transcriber and editor, rights to publications from other authors and transcribers, and copies of, quote, original records. These have not yet been digitized, those quote unquote original records. Some of them are photocopies of things that come from churches or towns or something like that. Others are the transcriptions that different people wrote as they looked at the original records. So as close as we are able to get to original records, that's what we now have in our office. Again, it is a very, very generous gift of the Kellys, and the NYG&B is extremely grateful to the Kellys. It does represent, as noted in Josh's quote here, one of the largest collections of materials related to upstate New York. And we will, under the careful stewardship of the NYG&B, be able to preserve these records and have them accessible in various different ways to people over time. There are quite a few books that are simply in print at this point, so that will be one of the ways that they'll be accessed in the early years. So their library does all these different types of records, and when you look into Kinship Books, you'll see all these different symbols for the record types on the covers of many of their books. So we are going to be careful stewards of their body of work. So as you read these works, understanding what the transcriber was going through is important. We highly encourage you to read the introductions and notes, and this really applies to any work that you are looking at. Understanding the record set is incredibly important. You'll see some examples of that a little bit later. You'll also want to see what cautions the transcriber or indexer has provided. Knowing how they handled any surname variants is important. And this is a quote about these records is in many of the transcriptions and abstracts from the Kellys and Kinship Books. And they try to do as faithful a copy as circumstances allow. And they will use different techniques to show where things are not necessarily as readable. And again, that last line there, apparent errors in spelling or dates were copied as found. Interpretation is left to you as the reader, as the user of these records. And so that really applies to most sources we use for genealogy. Again, just giving you again a list of some of the abstract and transcription record types. They also published their quarterlies. The quarterlies were named at the capital, the Columbia, the Mohawk, and the Saratoga. Those periodicals tended to contain record sets that were not large enough for an individual publication. So were combined into these quarterlies and serialized. So at this point in time, that's the format that we have them in. We'll be taking a look at that over time, but those quarterlies are available to some extent. We do have some print copies of them. We don't have all digitized copies at this point. What is important is the NYGNB has launched a revised website for kinshipny.com, and on it, and actually this big yellow arrow is not actually on the website. I want to point you to this search by surname. There is an online surname index that you can use to determine whether the surnames you are researching are available in kinship publications. So let's take a look at that. When you click on that, you come to this Kinship NY surname search page. And how you use that is you don't need these things up here with the red outline on the arrow. You do not need to click here to log in as a member. This is accessible to everyone. You don't need to log in. Please don't try and use the search box that's up in that upper right-hand corner. That's searching for the entire website. What you want to use is the search box right down here that has an arrow with a green around it. That's the one you want to use. You want to enter the family name there. So as an example, I put in Woodruff to see what would come up. Just waiting for everybody's screens to catch up for a moment here. The search results were quite extensive for the surname Woodruff. Being a sailor, I just love the first one being the account of the sloop Farmer docking at Rhinebeck, New York to New York City. But this list went on for quite some time. This is only a partial list of what came up with the surnames. So clearly there's lots to research. When any one of these titles, you can click on them, which is what, of course, I did for the account of the sloop Farmer. And this leads you to the publication. So you can take a look and see what that publication is about and read the description of that publication. So going back one more time, if you clicked on any one of these results in the search, it would take you to the web page that relates to that particular publication. So if we clicked on the Vital Records of St. Luke Lutheran, that would take us to the page for that publication. So that's how all of these are quite accessible and easily found through that surname search. So I want you to just keep in mind all these different record types as we go along. We're not going to see examples of every one of them tonight. And I do promise you this will not be a terribly long webinar. Those of you who wish to watch Finding Your Roots tonight will easily be in time if you're on the East Coast and need to be there by 8 o'clock and watching at your preferred format. So let's talk about church records for a minute. They are incredibly important substitutes for vital records, as probably many of you know, in New York, with civil vital records starting later than in, for instance, a lot of places in New England. It does encompass the majority of the works, but not by any means all of them that were published by the Kellys. So I'm sure you're dying to see an example, so let's just take a look. Looking at Coxsackie in Greene County, there are marriage records, for instance, for the First and Second Reformed churches. And right on the title page, Arthur Kelly gives you the dates for the First Reformed Church and the Second Reformed Church and how far the records go up to. You will see the marriages are numbered as follows. So he did a consecutive numbering, but started the Second Reformed Church at 2000. Of course, besides the abstracts for each of these, and here's a sample, those marriage numbers are in this item number. Okay, so if you look at, this is page 1 here, so it starts with item number 1 in 1797 of the marriage of Samuel Salisbury and Tanaka Hardwick. He was from Kinderhook, she was from Coxsackie. So those item numbers, I'm going to go to the first page of the index. The index goes by the marriage number, not by the page number. So in this publication, we're on page 75, which starts the marriage index, but notice these numbers are much higher than that. Those are the marriage number. So for instance, as we look under the Armstrongs and we look at Cynthia Armstrong here, her marriage number is 2238. So from the beginning of the book that we saw, the Second Reformed Church started with marriage number 2000. So right from the index, that's the implication that Cynthia was married at the Second Reformed Church in Coxsackie. So Arthur was very good about indexing all of the transcriptions. There are lots more church records. And I did mention, you remember a word about these records? I'm going to blow this up a little bit so it's easier to see for a moment here. Let people's screens catch up. This particular one, it's really important to read these because you can see in this that cautions are needed on using the records of this particular church. His script has proven to be the most difficult to decipher of the hundreds of ministers transcribed so far. Boy, he should have gone to penmanship school, right? That reverend? There's an additional problem. Book 1 was dismantled, and the loose sheets were inserted into a later volume. The newer volume also contains loose pages from later books, and this can lead to great confusion. So if this is a church and a community that you're researching in Fonda, New York, knowing this information from the transcriber is really important. So if the records don't make sense, there could be a good reason why. Okay, encouragement for all of us to be reading introductions. Another incredibly important book for Quaker research is the Quaker Census of 1828. Not only does this book, edited by Mr. Loren Fay, have the census information, which you can see the table of contents here. The census information starts on page 14, not on page 2, for instance. But he's got a lot of really good information that's formed in his introductory information. There are some caveats, some cautions and limitations, and describe some of the challenges with these records. There's a great section on research strategies, and then all these keys to the meeting locations and the monthly meetings, as well as the map of the 1821 meetings. Personally, I love maps. I love books that include maps. This is one for Quaker research that I use, and hopefully you will too. There are lots and lots of church records. On the website, if you look by category, you will see there's 9 pages worth of religious records. So there's plenty for you to sort through. There are things like store ledgers. Okay, and again, you've got a great introduction here about this daybook. Daybooks can be used by, usually they were store books. Daybooks can also be used by those who are collecting rents, for instance, or someone who is surveying properties. Daybooks can include a huge category, and they're not something that people always think to go and look at. In this case, Arthur Kelly went and looked at the 1900 census to see if the majority of the people lived in that area. So he did some extra work and tells you about it in the introduction. So again, this is a really good reason to look. And I love the last line here, that I note that the Walker surname does not show up as a customer in the index of this volume. And he was speculating that the 2 Walker brothers owned the store and could have been the owners of the daybook and probably didn't charge their family or didn't record when their family came to pick something up. Okay, moving on here. There are all sorts of different types of records, including something like this from Germantown. So this is what he called the Settlers and Residents, Volume 1, and you can see there's lots of different record types within this. You've got marriages, baptisms plus marriages, and this is only a part of the list, but you've got a lot of information all contained within one book. So moving on to the quarterlies, as they're called. Again, the names are the Capital, the Columbia, the Mohawk, and the Saratoga. And clearly these are regional, Capital being the Albany area, and not just the county, but some of the surrounding areas. Columbia, there's a lot of information for Columbia County. Mohawk goes out the Mohawk Valley. Saratoga is north of Albany. So we're going to take a moment and look at the Columbia. So when you look at these volumes of the quarterly, they were serialized. So there's a volume 1 and a number 1, 2, 3, and 4. So each of these types, unless they were completed in one issue, could go on from one to the next. Has a lot of good information. There are family Bible records. There are tax lists. This one just showing you a quick view of a tax list from Claverack, specifically the West District. There was another one from the Chatham Road tax list. So all sorts of tax lists. Tax lists can be very important for New York research. All of them are indexed. So you can find the indexes at the back. And he does note that the name may appear more than once on a page, but it's only going to be indexed once, which makes sense. There are newspaper abstracts as well. Again, I did talk about some of the concentration in Dutchess County. There were abstracts of newspaper deaths. And you would always want to know where they came from. So the introduction does tell you there was an index cards, 3x5 index cards. Do you remember them? At the Adrian's Memorial Library in Poughkeepsie. And it was from all these different newspapers. So if you find something in here, it could say, hey, I need to contact that library and see if they have a little bit more information as to which newspaper this could be coming from. There are also the More Vital Records, Fred Bowman's books. This is just a quick view of some of the newspapers in the 8,000 More Vital Records from Eastern New York State. So we're covering quite a few different record sets. So one of the questions certainly is, how do you access kinship books? Many libraries have purchased copies of these. So you can check, sorry, that's a typo. It's not WordCat, it's World, WORLDCAT.org. Hopefully many of you are using that. Let me just type that WorldCat into the chat box. If you just give me one moment, I'll do that so you have that URL. The indexes, the quarterlies have been indexed. You can obtain copies through the NYGNB Record Retrieval Service or the ACPL. The ACPL stands for the Allen County Public Library. They are the folks who actually do the indexing for Percy. And to access the Percy Index, those of you who are members of the NYGNB, your access to Find My Past through your NYGNB membership includes Percy. That's not normally on the simpler levels of subscription with Find My Past, but Percy is included in the NYGNB membership access to Find My Past. And you can certainly purchase copies from the website kinshipnewyork.com. So the NYGNB e-library, what we are going to start with is some images of certain original records and transcriptions. We've already put up that surname index. We'll try to work on enhancing those name indexes over time. That will take some time. Some publications over time may be added to the e-library, but that is going to take time. The digitization of record sets is sorely needed. We held a digitization day at the NYGNB today, and the people who were there began to index some of those quote-unquote original records, some of which are copies of original records, some in not really great shape. I don't want to tell you you're going to have pristine copies. Many of the copies of originals were taken many, many years ago. Remember, Arthur Kelly began transcribing in 1965, so its quality on some of them is not great. Others are better. We will, as always, provide the best copy we are able to when we do put up digital copies. So you can access, purchase copies of the kinship titles on kinshipny.com. As you scroll down the website, you will also be able to browse by location, so you can see the many locations, most of them obviously in New York. Some are just general United States, some are county specific. You can also see right in the middle, you've got Michigan and Massachusetts right there. You can also browse by subject. If there's a particular record type that you are interested in, you can take a look at those record types. So you can either use the search all products here, or you can browse by location. Either of those work well. We've already looked at the search by surname. So the website's pretty simple. Shouldn't be too difficult to navigate around. Again, we saw this earlier. When you search by a name, that's how you find things. And again, I think I mentioned this a minute or two ago, the digitization of original records. We had people, as I said, in the office today working on them. They're not always in the best shape. Sometimes they are extremely hard to read. Some of them are manuscripts, handwritten transcriptions by the people who transcribed the original records. So again, without actually going to a location and seeing those records yourself, then this is going to be the best you're going to be able to do at a certain point without travel. But we'd always encourage you to come to New York and travel. So if any of you are nearby, we do have digitization days. We have regular volunteers who come. We have occasional volunteers. We'll train you. Comfort with a computer is helpful. Anyone who wants to come and help with this digitization, you can email Anna King at aking@nygbs.org, or you can always email volunteer@nygbs.org. So just, and keeping up on the latest news, most of you hopefully are already on our e-news list. If you're not getting it, maybe you've inadvertently unsubscribed from us. We do tend to send the e-news about twice a month. And there is also information about new record sets and things like that in the New York Researcher. So we will keep you up to date in print in the New York Researcher as well. And so both of these sources will include updates on Kinship Books titles. So I do see that we have some questions. If you'll give me a moment, I will take a look and see which of those we're going to be able to answer in just a few minutes here. One of the questions is the Kinship database online? The Surname Index, let me go back for a moment here. That actually, this page got updated since this screenshot was taken, but the Kinship New York's surname search page is available. So you can get to this. Let me jump out of this for a second and just show you very quickly. When you are on the NYGNB website, nygbs.org, or typing out New York, NEWYORK, family history, we do have a box here for Kinship. When you click on that, you do see the announcement about our landmark gift from Kinship Books. And then you can also link straight over to the Kinship website. Hang on. Let me refresh that. That must have been left over from the other day when we were updating it. Here's the Kinship website, and you can go on here and click that search by surname, and you come to the Kinship New York surname search page. So that's the database that you can use. That, again, does not require member access. Anyone can search that. Matthew is asking, do we know how many more New York church records have yet to be transcribed? No, I don't think anyone's actually done, or I haven't seen published, a survey of every church in the state of New York. That certainly would be a massive project. There are still many. Clearly, the Kellys have done a good number of them. We have on our website in the NYGNB e-library a religious records transcription project. That some of the bulk of that is probably the ones that were done by Royden Woodward Vosberg, but there are other transcribers in that database. Clearly, the DAR, the New York State chapters of the Daughters of the American Revolution, have done a lot of transcription. So finding religious records, it does take some time. You may have to go local, and I would recommend that you use things like gazetteers, for instance, French's and uh, Spafford. I can never say his name quite right. In the New York Family History Research Guide and Gazetteer, there are a lot of strategies. There's a whole chapter on religious records and using gazetteers and finding which congregations existed at a time, and also who the archives are that might hold those records. So I've never seen a comprehensive inventory. Searching for an individual congregation or parish probably will take you a lot longer than finding a particular record that you're looking for in that set. Judy's asking, does the family history library have any of the kinship transcriptions? In fact, no. The transcriptions done by Arthur Kelly are under his copyright, which has now been transferred to the NYG&B. So the NYG&B now has the copyright on that. So those have not at this point been shared with the Family History Library and Family Search. Next questions from Betty and Kane. The church records appear to be mostly Dutch Reformed and related Protestant religions. She's asking about Roman Catholic records. Certainly, the earlier churches in New York tended to be the Dutch Reform, having had New York State effectively been founded by the West India Company and the related government from the Netherlands. Other denominations in the Reformed religions were the next generally to come into New York. The Catholic churches were not nearly as well tolerated until actually quite late when you think about the whole history of New York. So those were not generally some of the earlier churches. That being said, for Roman Catholic church records, I highly recommend, Betty, I haven't looked to see off the top of my head whether you're a member or not. We do have a partnership with Find My Past. Find My Past has been able to work with certain of the archdioceses of the Catholic Church and are in a multi-year project of indexing and digitizing records from the Catholic archdiocese. New York is one of those archdioceses. There is a webinar, recorded webinar on our website done by Jen Baldwin that was last summer. You can go to the tools and resources page to the webinars and videos. And I'm not logged in right now, so I wouldn't be able to pull up the webinar. But as you go through here, you will see right here, and if I click it, I think I'm not going to get to that page, but Exploring New York's Catholic Stories, the Archdiocese of New York collection on Find My Past. I would highly recommend viewing that webinar and checking in through your NYG&B subscription on Find My Past. We do have access to the New York Archdiocese records. So I hope I've answered your question there, Judy. Patty is asking, can we vote for which locations we hope will be digitized next? For instance, the Dutchess and Columbia counties. Patty, thanks for asking. We always love to hear from our members about what they'd like to see next. One of the things we are doing is doing the most what I'll call fragile records first of these originals. We want to ensure, because this is going to take some time, that those things that are in the toughest condition are digitized before other items. That doesn't mean they'll necessarily be the first things up on the website, but as far as the digitization process, preservation is paramount for us, and we do want to make sure that those are done. And the last question was a little bit more specific about Germantown. And the question on the people in Germantown, I would look at the dates for any ethnic groups that were coming into Germantown. As you read about the publications, you can learn what dates those record sets cover. So specifically, I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head. I'd have to actually go and look at the publication itself and the description. Some of the areas definitely tended to be settled, for instance, by Palatine Germans who were here quite early on. They started arriving in the fairly early 1700s. One of the reasons for the Germantown name is my understanding. Other ethnic groups obviously came to many parts of New York. The transcriptions tend to be those earlier records, and certainly a little bit more about time periods before civil vital records came into New York. So I think we've covered most of the major questions. I thank you for your attention tonight. We hope you will be able to use many of these records. Certainly, spending 50 or more years transcribing records, we certainly can appreciate what the Kellys have gone through in transcribing all of these, and also in their generous donation to the NYG&B of all of these record sets. If we missed any questions, we'll try and answer them by email to you as soon as possible. And thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget that we have a webinar tomorrow evening for the newspapers. So thank you and have a great evening, everyone. And I'll probably join you in watching Finding Your Roots. Good night, everyone.